All righty, it's thinking, and I think we are live. I think if it says live, we're live, right? That's how this stuff works. Well, hello everyone. I'm so excited to have you here on World Book Day, no less, which is today. So that is the perfect discussion to have. And I'm just realizing I have my sound on. Well, that is stupid. Here we go. Sorry about that. Welcome, World Book Day, and welcome to a new series on my channel called Reading Across the Shelf, where we talk about diversity in books, diverse authors, diverse just whatever we like in books and reading. And this is our kickoff conversation. I'm super excited to be joined by Chaz, Ursi, Philip, and Joanna to talk generally today about what we enjoy when it comes to diversity in reading, what we're looking for when we want to read diverse books. And all that kind of fun stuff. And I think we should start with a quick introduction. So let's do round robin, Chaz, if you want to start.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Chaz, or Charles if you prefer. My channel is Bookish Chaz, and I mostly review fantasy and sci-fi, some mystery as well. And yeah, been on YouTube almost 3 years. It's been fun.
Nice. My name's Ursi. My channel is called Circe's Booked, and I read a little bit of everything, and I like to talk about a little bit of everything on my channel. So I'm all over the place, and that's kind of how I like it. So.
I'm Philip, and my channel is pretty much dedicated to fantasy. Although in my day job, I am a medievalist, so I can occasionally be induced to recite Old English, but it works really well at cocktail parties. So,
yeah. It's a party trick.
Rightfully so.
Hi, my name is Joanna, and on my channel, I mostly focus on fantasy, but I do read other genres as well. And I'm very excited to be here and talk about this topic.
Awesome. And just in case, because I know we have a lot of visitors that you all invited to this conversation. Hi, I'm Fina, or Josephine. My channel is Fina Reads, and I also read mostly fantasy and sci-fi, but similar to Ursi, I like everything else as well. So
all over
the place, And I see there are a lot of great folks here. Hello, everyone. Great that you're here. I'm really excited. We have a bunch of questions for the group and that we're talking through the group as well. Feel free to add in the chat as well what you think about all of these questions and, what your favorite diverse reads are. But we wanted to start off in general. So what does diversity in books mean to you all? Why is this an important topic for you? Want to do the same round, Chaz? Why don't you start?
Okay, sounds good. So diversity is it's personally important to me as well as something that I always love to look for in books. I have people that are very deeply important to me that come from all different spectrums, LGBTQ, Black, Hispanic, people of color, and celebrating that and elevating that is something that is really important to me, and it's something that I really enjoy seeing in books that I read. So that's kind of what I look for when I hear about a book that has a lot of this diversity in it, and I pick up that book. I'm like, oh, those are some of the things I'm looking for. It elevates positively the fact that there is so much diversity in our world besides the cookie cutter that we typically see or used to typically see in entertainment. It's becoming more diverse now, but
yeah. Ursi, how about you?
So I think for me, it's very similar to what Chaz has said. Growing up, I have just like a quick little thing, I guess. I grew up in Queens, New York, and it's super diverse, like to the point where I didn't even understand the concept of like racism for a while because of how incredibly diverse everything was around me. Like I could not comprehend like this idea of like people subjugating other people because of their difference, because everyone was so different around me, right? Like it was just something I just could not understand until I was a little older. And you know, you see things a little more complexly like as you get older. And those are some of the things that I strive towards reading in books, like having that understanding of how other people were treated, you know, around the world and everything. And I feel like that's something that is really near and dear to me, being that, you know, we grew up like so with people from all over the world, right? Like it was always one of those things where it was a mixture of pride and learning from one another. And I find myself gravitating towards those books. I don't know if it's something I intentionally like seek out. Like I'm looking for African literature. I'm looking for this. It's just one of those things that like automatically is just like an interest of me, and like I gravitate towards those things. So having perspectives of like, you know, being around so many different kinds of people and from all over the place, or that identify in all these different ways, those are just the kind of things that just like interest me. And so then I'll just grab those books. And I think it's important to talk about those things too, because I didn't learn, I couldn't understand these things until I moved out of New York, and you see things a little differently. And that's where I was like, okay, this makes sense now. And I'm seeing it in my books, and I get it. And it's always just been something that like interested me. And I think it's kind of reflected in all the things that I talk about on my channel a lot.
Yeah,
I'll let Philip go on.
I'm going to echo what Ursi just said. My older daughter lives in Queens, and it is, I believe, the most diverse place on the planet, is what I've heard. So very cool. And also, I think what Alicia wrote here in the chat, her 2 reasons that she gave. So reason number 2 is something I really resonate with. And it's similar to what Ursi was just saying, I think, which is that it's a bit selfish in a way, because I learn a lot from other people's experiences, people who have experiences that differ from my own. It's an opportunity for me to see the world from different lens and to enrich myself with that. So I think it's just one of the most, for me, in my life, that has been one of the most powerful experiences I've ever been through, is trying to learn from other people who have perspectives that differ from mine. And that is something that I deeply appreciate. So it is something that I look for in literature. At the same time, it's a bit of a paradox, really, because while I do learn from people who have different experiences and backgrounds from my own, at the same time, it's really cool when I recognize myself in them as well, when I see their humanity along with my own in their lived experiences. I feel a very powerful sense of connection with people who are maybe on the surface very different from me. But when I realize, oh, wow, these are emotions that I've been through, these are experiences that I've had as well. And I just find it so wonderful and powerful and beautiful that I can connect with people that way, because I think that literature does put into words what our souls know as human beings.
Yeah.
And that is,
love that.
that's something that
I like that too.
Yeah, it's just for me, that's why I love literature, period. And I feel like I learn so much when I'm reading the perspective of people who have experiences, things to offer me. So, yeah.
That's so beautifully said. And hello, Alicia. She and I just got off a live show together. But like Alicia, I'm Hispanic. I grew up in a Hispanic community. So it was very common to eat Mexican food and hear mariachis and things like that. So I thought I was growing up in a diverse community, and it wasn't until I moved to Georgia that I realized, wow, there's a lot for me to learn about the world. And even just traveling around the world in various places, there's a lot to learn. And I feel as though choosing to read a book that presents a viewpoint other than my own is a beautiful way to connect to other perspectives. But I think what I also appreciate, what I look for when I'm thinking about diversity when it comes to reading is one, of course, seeing perspectives other than my own, but also like going into depth about that too, because I think it's one thing to just show representation in a book, but another thing to really show sort of the nuanced complexity of a different perspective, of a different way of being, of a different way of life. And through that, I can engage, should I choose, in empathy and compassion. And I think that those things are so valuable, so important. And I think it does connect me in through that way to my humanity. And of course, seeing the beautiful themes of connection that Philip just talked about as well. So it's very important. It's become even more important to me, I would say, in recent years. Not only, like I said, just representation alone, but also just going more in depth with the representation.
Yeah.
Same here.
Agreed. So, I mean, for me, it's very, very similar to what all of you mentioned, right? So back in high school, in my teens and early 20s, I didn't care for school a whole lot. I skipped school a lot, and I was just, not interested in learning at all. And I missed out on so many things, and I'm just now realizing it. So, I'm now trying to kind of catch up on everything that I should have learned early on about the world and the history and everything that is going on everywhere. And I just didn't. And I realized that about like 3-4 years ago, sadly enough, when I started with my master's and we were looking into how do you conduct business in other countries, learning about other cultures, cultural dimensions. If anyone knows about Hofstede dimensions, I found that incredibly fascinating. And since then, I'm really catching up and trying to learn more about, okay, so how do people live all over the world? What is their history? What are their traditions? And books, especially fantasy books that have inspiration from all these areas, highlight that very beautifully. And it makes learning a lot more fun than, listening to a teacher all day long. No offense, Phil. But yeah, it's really this catching up and realizing there's so much more than what you see every day in your neighborhood when you walk your dog around the corner, right? And learn from other people, to your point, Philip, right, that have maybe similar experiences, but that approached things just very differently. And then growing from that, being able to grow from that and be like, okay, there are other ways on how I can handle certain situations. And that's just, that's just why I'm really interested in all sorts of books all over the place, from everywhere, written by really anyone.
I guess just to bounce off your point there about like the school system, like not to like bash school or anything too much, but I just remember like even like the standard history education, right? Like I majored in history in college, right, for my undergrad. And we had to seek out those different stories from different cultures at the university level, and they're not very much focused on in high school and junior high school, right? Like you get your standard curriculum of American history here in the United States, right? And it isn't until college that I was able to take those courses on like we got to, you had to, for my history major, you had to like take your standard, European history, American history, but then you have like your focus, your concentration. And that is where I was able to go and take like Latin American history, African history, Asian history, Indian history, like South Asian history. Like it wasn't until I was in college that I was able to have access. I don't know if it's like access, but like more of a study on those cultures, because it wasn't really highlighted until that time. And it was my choice to do that. It wasn't even like it was on purpose. Like there were other concentrations that I can do, but it was a choice. And I don't know if that's the right approach for our society in general to really approach diversity and like learning about other cultures, rather than having just these little side bits infused within the mainstream. Sorry, my hand gestures. My husband makes fun of me all the time because I'm always
I'm all over the place too.
Yeah.
So.
But it's just like you have these little tidbits of, you know, different societies, but the main idea is like the standard American history or curriculum. And then it isn't until you seek out those things that you can learn about different cultures. So I think that's what you were saying earlier about like not having that much of an interest. I think it goes back to kind of like that idea of like, what are we actually teaching our students?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
what are we doing in terms of trying to teach about other people, right? And have this understanding. And I just think that's super interesting to like see.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I
I think
agree.
that, sorry,
Yeah.
Paul, go ahead.
Oh no, well, I was going to respond as an educator to all the educational observations, which I think you guys are actually so correct.
Yeah.
And it's interesting from my perspective as a literature professor. I've been doing this for 25 years or so, and I would say that it's a fair observation that textbooks have become much more diverse than they were 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And I think that's a really good thing. And I've seen that result in some of my students feeling more invested because they see their stories reflected in these textbooks now where they wouldn't have 20 years ago. And I think it's very important that an educational system needs to serve everyone. And that it is important for my students to see their stories reflected. And it's important for them to be exposed to other people's stories. So ideally, the Intro to Literature textbook that I use, that we have short stories and poems and drama, is going to have a great mix of all kinds of perspectives and experiences. And that is going to be a more enriching class for everyone, because you'll have more people engaged because they do see their stories there. And that is important. But also, it's more enriching because you're learning more and more other perspectives at the same time. So that is something I think is a very positive thing. And within the genre that we all have in common, fantasy, I feel like we're in a golden age because of the diversity that has increased in the last couple decades within the genre. I'm very excited for fantasy because of that.
Same here, Philip. I'm very excited about that as well.
Yeah,
People are starting to see the value in it.
Yeah. And actually, Philip, there was a comment earlier on the week that was video where you said, hey, I'm in that conversation later. There was a comment earlier, and I took a screenshot of that because I thought it was so fitting, from Vaughn Roycroft. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right.
Oh, yes,
he's saying is the genre, and he's saying fantasy has come a long way in a relatively short time. There's a long way to go, of course, but it's something we can all be a part of just through inclusion in our reading choices, something to stay mindful about as we all take the journey together. And I thought that was such a great comment from him, right? And it also fits nicely into our next question as well, right? What do you look for when it comes to diverse reading? Because you made the point, both of you, Ursi and Philip, saying there is some proactive means that we still have to do, but there are some things that helps us being more exposed to just things that are different to what we are used to, right? Even as Latina, to your point of you grew up in Queens and it looked all normal, being exposed to things outside of Queens, right? It goes, it's all across the same realm. So what do you look for when it comes to diverse reading? Maybe the other way around now, John, starting with John.
Yeah, I'm sorry, because I think I kind of answered this a little bit, but I do want to say that I do, even though I love fantasy and I love seeing the direction that fantasy is going, I have found that for me personally, it does help to read other genres of literature as well. I found that even before starting BookTube, and I don't really read as much young adult literature as I used to, I was kind of going through a phase of just kind of going through some young adult literature. And honestly, I think I was doing that because I was craving diversity. And I found that there was so much more representation in young adult fantasy and young adult literature, even about like social issues or intersectionality or, any sort of things like that I just find fascinating. I find intersectionality fascinating. just any sort of challenge that anybody goes through with having sort of a different kind of identity or maybe a minority identity of some sort, because I want to know how to be more sensitive to people like that in my real life if I encounter that. And so that is something that has been very meaningful for me to discover when I read a diverse amount of literature. And as far as reading, let's see, what do I look for when it comes to diverse reading? So I think there's so many ways to handle that. Like I said, you could go through different genres. You can go through, even within fantasy, you can go through different types of fantasy. You could look through for different types of authors who are represented in your author choice. So especially in the fantasy realm, we've seen a dominance in adult fantasy of white male authors, and not to say anything's wrong with that, but it's good to bring more diversity in, like looking at more female authors of color, just looking at trying to include more of those other kinds of perspectives into your reading choices, from the author perspective, from even the books that you're reading, from the genres you're reading. And I don't know, I don't think there's any really wrong way to diversify your reading as long as you are choosing to do so.
Absolutely.
I think, Philip, on the YA topic, right, you read a book that is sometimes considered YA just recently, the Devabah trilogy, the first book of that. I don't know. I don't think it's YA, but I know sometimes it's classified in that direction. So you also started, it is an amazing book. I mean, definitely. So you started branching out in that direction too.
Yeah, I guess I kind of agree with you. I tend to think of it as not so much YA, and I know that's a whole discussion there too, where it tends to be the case that a lot of women authors get lumped into YA, and that is sort of a controversial thing, I think. And I just tried to read that with a completely open mind, and I would not classify it as YA myself. And by the way, I don't think YA is a bad thing. I read plenty of YA books that I love, and I think they play a very important role in our reading and bringing people into reading. And I can't tell you how many wonderful bonding experiences I've had with my daughters reading YA books and so on and so forth. So it's interesting to me how that happens. And then there are some certainly male fantasy authors that don't get talked about as often as being YA, but I would consider more YA. Like, for example, Brandon Sanderson would be, for me, more of a YA in many respects. And I don't mean that as a bad thing. I think he's incredible, and I love that he's brought so many readers into the genre. But I think it's interesting how that doesn't get talked about as much as perhaps some of the female authors. But it's a great. I thought the City of Brass was a great read, and I thought she handled the character work brilliantly, and the setting was fantastic. It was she's very, very knowledgeable about the lore from a broad swathe of the world there, and that shows in her writing. So I really enjoyed it. But as far as, that's a great, As far as when it comes to diversity in reading, for me, what do I look for? I always look for great literature, of course, literature that speaks to me. To me, when I think about what am I going to read, one of many questions is one of the considerations. Let's put it that way. Is certainly various kinds of diversity. And if it's an author who is coming from a part of the world that I am unfamiliar with and that I haven't read a lot of books from, for me, that's a plus. That's an opportunity for me. And so that is certainly a factor in what I decide to pick up in my reading. And there are gaps, certainly, in my knowledge of the world. Plenty of those gaps. I keep trying to fill them, and then there are more.
Yes, but I feel the same way.
Yeah.
But which is a good thing, right? Nobody can know everything that is going on in the world. So it's a good thing. We will never be bored when it comes to learning something else or a little bit more.
Yep. That is
Yeah.
for sure. And the sad thing though is the more I know I don't know, and it looks, the task gets bigger and bigger. So not smaller as I get older. So, but that's a plus for me. That is something I think that is an important factor in what I'm deciding to read. And it's certainly what I'm thinking as an educator. Certainly when I'm planning a class, when I'm making a syllabus for a class, it is a major question for me. Do I have diverse representation in my readings for this class? And is it possible for me to pick some great, poems from a group that isn't represented in this class yet, or that I haven't done much with? So that is certainly an important question for me.
I really love that. That's such a great
Yeah,
response.
that's excellent from an educator's perspective.
Yeah.
Being intentional about that, I think, is really important.
I can
Yeah,
highly
we are.
recommend
Bravo.
when it comes to diverse poems, Blood Dazzler. I just finished that by Patricia Smith. Just in case you're looking for something, it's about a book of poems about Hurricane Katrina and what they went through, like the individual people that were in New Orleans. Oh my goodness!
Oh wow,
sorry.
that's cool.
My
So,
brother did some
Just
work.
to add to your curriculum. Sorry, John. I
I
didn't.
was just gonna say my brother lived in Gulfport, Mississippi when Hurricane Katrina hit. So I mean, he evacuated, but he was part of the cleanup and everything for that. So I just love hearing his stories about that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was just going to say really quickly that I think we, I know people are so hard on educators these days. I do think that at least at the higher ed level, I am seeing a lot of change on that level, at least in my area. I'm seeing a lot of work on decolonizing the music classroom, for example, and not only incorporating more works of literature from other underrepresented cultures and voices, but also bringing conversations about these cultures into it, which is so important. Yeah, but as far as what Maddie was saying earlier, I do think that YA is ahead of the game versus adult fantasy. And I'm pretty generic. I tend to think of YA. I guess I do have some parameters of what I think associate with YA. And I don't think YA is bad. Like I said, I was reading a lot of YA there for a while there. But I think of it more, I guess I just think of it a little more coming of age story is when I think of YA. And I know there are exceptions to that. However, I do think they are ahead of the game as far as diversity is concerned. And I think adult fantasy is starting to catch up, but there are still areas, like, for example, me being Hispanic, the only Hispanic or the only Mexican fantasy author I know of is Sylvia Moreno Garcia.
Yeah.
Anyone I know of. Yeah, and you all can let me know too, recommendations here in this group and in the chat. I'd love to hear any.
Oh, there's that new one that just came out. I think it was featured on like Book of the Month, and people were like talking about it. And I think it's more like Ecuador, like an Ecuadorian
I think
tale.
I know what you're talking about. Yes.
The Inheritance of Orquídea
Yes.
Divina, right? Yeah. So I haven't read it yet, but I really, really want to.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. So I think we definitely have a need for filling in more.
Yeah, I just got a book from a self-published author named Tiago Abdallah, and he's from Brazil, I believe, originally.
Oh, I've been seeing his book around. Yeah.
Yeah, Andrew from
yeah,
Andrew
I just got it too.
Reads and Alan both, I think, reviewed his book recently. So
okay.
There's one. Also, if you expand it if you include under fantasy magic realism, then you got a whole world of
yeah. That's
Forget
true.
about it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's true.
Yeah, that's it. A Touch of Light. Evie has the title there.
Yeah.
And that's actually a good point, Philip, because I know that I had a wonderful conversation with Alicia last week on translated literature on my channel. And one thing we were talking about, or that she brought up, is that sometimes works around the world, they might be fantasy, but they might be a little more genre bending, or maybe fall into more of the magical realism spectrum side of fantasy. And so they don't really get as much attention as sort of the standard fantasy that we're used to seeing here, promoted around here.
Yeah, very true. I know having read The Witcher, and that was translated, I've loved those books, and just admire so much not only the work that the author put into it, but the work that the translators went into to bringing it to English. So yeah. One author that I read, it's been about a year ago now. It's a book called Meddling Kids. I can talk about it later, but Edgar Quintero is he's from Spain, wrote that book, and I think it was originally written in, and I'll mispronounce this, probably Catalan. I think it was originally written in Catalan and translated. I could be wrong though, but it's a great book.
Great, thanks.
I'll write it down.
Wow. I have to write a list here.
Yeah, there's already that posted.
I've already started.
Right.
Do you mean Catalan? Is that what you meant?
Catalan. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if we go outside of fantasy, and it also falls into the magical realism space again, it's that Zafran. I'm blanking on the first name right now, but it's those 4-book series about where he disappears in the world of books. Shadows of the Wind is the first book.
Oh, yes. Okay, I have seen that cover. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. That's very popular.
Carlos Ruiz Zafón, and I'm probably pronouncing it terribly right now. So
yeah, I've heard that one's very popular too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when we're talking about YA is ahead of the game and generally the representation, it's probably it's very likely just a market demand type of situation, right? If you look at millennials and younger, they are just so much more aware of, hey, we need diversity. We're expecting diversity. All of these conversations are happening because that generation is just so up on their game on that and saying like, no, we want this. Like, we're expecting you all across any aspect of life to have that. And all the older generations, oh my goodness, I feel old right now. They're catching on to that, right? It just takes a little bit of time to say like, okay, maybe we should look into other authors and non-US authors that write about non-Western topics to add that to our library. Like Orbit has been really good, I find, lately with diversifying their roster of authors and everything. Yes, thanks, Alicia. Yep, that one.
Thank you. I think also some of you were mentioning self-published authors. I think that's also maybe a good way to go to find some diversity as well.
That is very true. That is one, because we talked about Daevabad. For me, it's always kind of in waves. Like I read one book about something that I'm really interested in, and then I look for more books in that same area. So when I read the Daevabad trilogy like 1.5 years ago, it's like, oh, I want to read more about Middle Eastern inspired things. So I read Gunmetal Gods afterwards by Zamil Akhtar, which is a self-published work, which is the totally other spectrum of Middle Eastern inspiration, where you have Daevabad more being like a much more cheery world. And it's not all unicorns and rainbows over there either, but it's a very specific world where you have a very specific set of Middle Eastern inspiration. And Gunmetal Gods goes so much deeper and shows a different aspect of Middle Eastern folklore. And it's a lot darker, like call it grimdark if that is the right word for that, I'm not sure, but it is really bleak, really dark, inspired by more Ottoman history, and then is using a totally different aspect of that folklore. And that's what I find so interesting too, right? It's not just, oh, you read one book and then you know everything. It's you read one book and then you read another book with that same inspiration, but you get such a different picture from that author because they have just a different interest or a different experience that they bring to the table.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, Alicia has a kind of a question there that I think is actually really important. And I'd love to hear what you guys think. It's a sort of several posts or several comments in a row. But I think it's really important. If you guys don't mind, maybe we could try to answer her question.
Here's where it sits. Yeah.
Yeah. So the excuse that it's hard to find great literature among diverse authors, and that I think that is a line of reasoning that, frankly, I don't buy so much,
Right.
and I think there's less and less grounds for that claim. But I would like to hear the rest of you respond to that as well. But I don't buy it as a reason, honestly. I think if you really want to find great literature from all over the world, you can. It's out there, and it just hasn't had the attention in the past that it deserves. So.
Yeah, I mean, you may have to do a little footwork from time to time, put in the effort, but it's out there to be found if you want to find it. So yeah, I agree. That's I don't think that's a valid excuse, Philip.
I think the challenge is maybe I'm critically thinking of this question, like how
same.
Yeah, maybe the challenge is that some people can be like, read this book because it's diverse rather than read this book because it's great literature. And maybe just the way that it's framed in conversation can build sort of like a subconscious implicit bias towards it.
Yeah, but I wouldn't mind read it because it's both, it can be both. Yeah.
It can be both. Yes.
Yeah. I was going to say that too. It's kind of complicated in terms of like, how do you define what is great literature, right? And by whose standards?
Exactly.
I think is the question that we need to kind of go into with that. Like who's making these rules? Who is defining what is the traditional, what is great, what is, because that's great in terms of our culture here, but what is great in like Colombia, right? What is great in China or Japan, right? Or India, right? Like there's so much literature coming out of India, but we don't know because not all of it is translated yet, right? And
that's a really great point, Ursi. Yeah.
So it's who's defining what is great, and I think it kind of goes back to that question, not to kind of divert away from it, but like as far as like what we look for, because we all want to be reading great books, right? We don't want to be bored. We don't want to be, but what are the topics that interest you, and do they also coincide with what is defined as diverse, right? And I think that's sort of where I lean towards when it comes to the books, because I had to write it down because I ramble, but it's not something I research and seek out. But my interests just so happen to be books that the general public would consider diverse, right? So any books that talk about like race, colonialism, gender, right? The spectrum of sexuality and stuff like that. Those are the things that interest me. And they just so happen to fall under this category of diverse books, but under whose standards? Like, why can't they just be great books, right?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
And I think this is, and while I'm talking about it, then we can talk about JR's comment there too. I think it's also a historic aspect, right? The Western culture is just so big, and they always overran others. If you look at hundreds of years in the past, right, Roman Empire and whatnot, the traditional Western white culture overran others, and there was always this notion of everybody who is not white is lesser. And that's, and with that notion, there's still some parts of our general culture that kind of is just so used to it that they're not seeing that this is actually not necessarily the best way of looking at it. I don't want to say incorrect way, but you know what I'm trying to say. It's just we have lived with this for so many years that it's now really a hard fight to say, listen, there's just so much more to the world than what we've experienced since the Middle Ages, or maybe even before then, right? I'm not a history expert. There you see my lack of school knowledge. But there's just so much more to it. And because of the globalization of the world, we are now just way more exposed to that. We now all of a sudden see and can hear from people that we weren't able to see and hear from before, because again, we were not exposed to it, right?
Right. There's more access now.
Yeah.
That's another thing too. And because we're so much more connected, I think it's easier to find those things, but it's a matter of if the general public, whoever they are, right, wants to read those things and make it marketable for these publishers, these publishing agencies, and what's going to sell. Because at the end of the day, it's all about the dollars too, right? Like what's going to sell, what's going to be published, what's going, and it's these people in these publishing agencies too that are deciding what do the people want, because they want to make money off of it too.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And so it there's so many layers to it, and it's hard to like be like, well, this needs fixing, it's like a whole general, like everything, we need to look at every aspect of it and try to see where can we promote this even more, right? Or does it have to even fall under that category of diverse? Like, this is just a great book, this is a
Yeah.
cool book. Or even like the age range, right? Like we were talking about YA books too, where there's more of those topics and within the YA area, but why are we not seeing that in like more adult literature? And I don't know if it's that we're not seeing it here, or if it's just not getting published enough. I don't know.
That's why I do think there is a distinction a bit between YA and adult literature. I know there can be blurry lines for sure, and there's a spectrum, but I do think it's because of the way publishers are publishing certain content in spectrum in areas. So yeah, that's a really good point though.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that just going quickly back to something you were saying early, or reading books, because they are great literature, and promoting them as such, even if they're diverse, and even if it's something that the publisher thinks they won't make money off of, I think that's the biggest thing, is they need to look a little deeper and say, okay, will we actually make money off of this, regardless of what we think we'll make money off of?
Right.
And I think that's where a lot of change needs to happen. And I think that's where self-publishing is really becoming a gold standard for diversity, is because they don't have to cater to what the publisher wants.
Yeah.
They just put their stuff out there and people appreciate it. And it's awesome.
Yeah. I also think JR's comment, and I just so I can go back to that. Yeah, because I think, and that is also, again, you see that more in YA than in adult fantasy or sci-fi, is this, hey, let's play around with something traditionally Western and diversify it. What happens then? Let's go through that thought process and have, people of color in a story that is usually only represented by white people, or let's have an LGBTQ representation as part of the story. I think that I have seen more and more in the last year too, which I find very interesting, to help with that. There's more than that out there. Let me show you how else you could look at this same story with different eyes.
I actually I was in a meeting with Michael R. Fletcher, self-published author, the other night, and he was telling us in that discussion that a trick he uses in writing is sometimes to do a gender flip. So he'll write a male character maybe, and then after he's created the male character, I guess in the back end of things, or in the front end of things, I should say, before he publishes it, he'll just flip the gender.
Oh, I like that.
Anything about the character at all except the gender.
That's cool.
That is interesting.
I didn't know that
approach too. Yeah,
that was an interesting writing technique.
That's cool.
And then also, I wanted to acknowledge Alicia's Western Latin America is in the West. If you look at a flat map, yes, you're right.
For real.
Technically, there's nothing to the West, right? Because it's a globe. So where do you start?
Exactly.
I love seeing those clips of people like interviewing like South American people. Like I think it was like this one clip or something. I think it was like on TikTok or something. And it was like this guy asking like a guy in I think like Argentina or something. And he's like, oh, what do you think of like Americans? And he's like, I am American. This is South America. This is South America. Stop saying that the United States is the only people that are American.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's this whole idea of what we've been programmed to think, right? With our education. I don't know. Like it's hard. Like I don't want to be bashing education because like that's where I come from too, like, and it's just those things that you notice and you see and you're like, well, why do we think that way? And you start to question these things, right? I don't know.
Yeah. There's also one more comment around.
I like that comment. Yes.
Yeah. it's a good story first and foremost. I especially like the second part with the checking boxes. There's hurt many writers. That's to the point back of if you try to monetize it just because it's a trend right now, I completely agree. If there is no soul behind it, right, as Philip said early on, if your soul is not in it and you're just writing something to get the dollars because it's something right now that people want to hear,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful too, because tokenism is offensive. You know, it is not what it's hopefully we're moving beyond tokenism, and we're reaching a point of more meaningful inclusion of diversity in our stories. But it is, I think it's incredibly insulting actually when you come across tokenism, and so
it is.
So I guess, I guess speaking to Philip's point, like I recently read a book called The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois.
I want to read that so bad.
It was amazing.
It's getting longer.
It's a historical fiction book by Henry Jeffers, and it's very unapologetically a Black feminist book. And so it really took a deep dive into life in Black communities. And I live in Georgia, and a lot of it takes place in Georgia. But it gave me an insight. And I think what the author said, her intent was to give a white person a perspective inside a Black community and seeing what Black people are like when they're not around white people, that there's a whole different kind of way of being, and, the culture, like just certain aspects of Black community cultures and things like that. And especially how this plays out for women and some of the challenges Black women face specifically. And so from what Philip is saying about tokenism, I appreciated that book so much. It deepened my perspective and understanding so much of where I live and the people around me that I interact with on a daily basis. And so I wouldn't have gotten that perspective if it had been just a book about, that shows a token Black person in the book, or, that kind of just checked the box in that sense.
Yeah.
So I do feel you on that. I think that's a good point.
What was the book again? Sorry, I didn't.
Sure, yeah. It's a historical fiction book. It's called The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. It's a huge book, but
it's a big one.
So good.
That's okay. We are not shying away from big books here.
Yeah.
I think I wrote that as one of my categories of what do you kind of look for and kind of thing. And I think it wound up being a list of like what I kind of throw out the window, right? And it's like length is one of those, like, I'm not going to knock a book just because it's too long or it's too short, right? Another thing, right? Or you're not going to knock a book because it's a YA book or a middle grade book. Like if it sounds interesting and it sounds cool and it sounds fun and it's interesting, why not read it? Like I'm not going to just set it aside just because it's middle grade, right?
Yeah. I completely agree.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that's important. I think representation is important, but it's also really useful to get complex and nuanced perspectives too, and hear people's learn about people's perspectives and challenges, and that from people who may not have lived the same kind of life or that you have.
So since we're talking about some of our books that we like as well, just stumbling to the next question, trying to move us forward in a really not elegant way here. Tell us a bit more about what are your favorite diverse books? Which are the ones that you recommend to the people joining us here on the chat, or generally recommend to anyone they should read? Want to go the top round again?
Which way are we going?
I don't know anymore. How about you? Let's start with you.
Oh, me? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the one that I wrote down for this, it's classified as Afrofuturism sci-fi. And this book is Remote Control by Nnedi Okorafor. Such a good book.
I've seen that one. Yeah.
Oh, it's so good.
Yes.
Okay. So the blurb that it says, and I'm going to read this to you guys because I thought it was so cool. And it's, she's the adopted daughter of the angel of death. Beware of her. Mind her. Death guards her like one of its own. Right. And that's like the the blurb that it says, right? And it's such a cool book. It's very short, and it's by Nnedi Okorafor. She is, I believe she's from Nigeria. I'm pretty sure, but it's a coming of age story, and it has, you know, explores so many themes. You know, obviously the coming of age. It talks about the role of death, gender, and it's a commentary also on like corporate colonialism too. I think is one of the things that it talks about. But as far as the story itself, it follows a young girl. Her name is Fatima. Later on, she starts going by the name of Sankofa, and she finds like this alien relic that grants her this power or curses her with this power of death, and she can cause death, and she winds up going on this journey alone to find this relic again that has been stolen from her, so maybe she can kind of fix herself, right? And as she's going on this journey, you're seeing lots of tidbits of African culture, how people approach her because of her age, her gender, who she is, this lore. I think the commentary is so great. It's such a good, and it's such a cool book too. Like, it's not even just because it touches on all these things. Like, it's really good. Like, it's so entertaining. I was gripped. I had my husband read it, and he listens to a lot of audiobooks, and we both listened to it through audio, and it's such a phenomenal book, and I always recommend it. It's such a great book. I really love it. So it does fall under sci-fi, but I think it's such a cool book, and it's one of my favorites.
Wow,
awesome.
So, yeah.
Sounds great. Yeah. Does that make me next, or are we going this way? Or
I don't know anymore.
I just want to chime in and say that that's actually an author I really want to get to. I just heard about her other book, Who Fears Death, which is kind of a sci-fantasy book. And I'm very, very interested in that book.
Yeah, like I want to read more from her. This is the only book that I've read from her, but all her other books I always think these just sound really interesting and I want to read them, but I just haven't because I'm in the middle of all these Stephen King King tomes.
I have The Vanished Birds on my shelf. I need to get to that one.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Another one that I want to read. But yeah, I'm sorry, Philip.
Oh no, don't be sorry. I love hearing your answer. I'm gonna go with what I've actually said when I make these kind of silly top 10 videos for fantasy. One that has been consistently in my top 5 is N.K. Jemisin's The Broken Earth trilogy.
You stole mine. No, I'm kidding.
Sorry.
It's all good, man. It's all good. It's a great pick.
But, it diverse from my perspective because it introduces the main character as a person of color, is a woman. And there are... I just don't know a better story I've ever read in terms of portraying both oppression and human resilience. And I found it incredibly moving. I just found it incredibly moving to read that trilogy. And I think there's something about mothers also that always kind of get me. And that is a book that portrays motherhood in such a powerful way. So these are all things that are not my, primary experience. This is what we were talking about from the very beginning. I don't have direct access to these experiences because I am a white male. I am a father, but that's not quite the same thing, I think, as being a mother. So I felt so enriched by reading those books because of that, and because they're just amazingly written. And also, N.K. Jemisin takes these incredible narrative risks in there that really, for me anyway, really paid off, especially at the end. It was an incredible ending. And so for all those reasons, I guess that would be my go-to answer to that particular question. But I'll stick with the Broken Earth trilogy, which nice. It was one of the first things I talked about on my channel. Actually, I had a discussion with my older daughter, the one who lives in Queens, about this trilogy, which she loves as well. So
that was a great video. Everybody needs to watch that video. Yeah, I enjoyed that one.
Yeah,
I have
my
it behind
daughter
me
had
here.
a
I
lot of.
haven't read it yet.
Yeah, it's got some spoilers in the video, so you might want to wait till after you read the books. But
I still need to read the Broken Earth trilogy.
Me too.
oh yeah,
Read along, because I need to read it too. Read
Fantastic
along.
Want to read
series.
along, yeah.
Buddy read. No.
I have them here. I really want to read them too, but
Same.
squirrel. There's always something else.
Always.
So Philip brought up motherhood, and Alicia brought up The Sword of Kaigen, and that book, I think, explores motherhood so well. Diverse perspectives on motherhood. Excellent standalone, self-published book. There are some things about it that I think could have been handled maybe a little better, but I really love the book. It stayed with me. I still think about it. It moved me emotionally, especially in the middle of the book. But overall, that's a great recommendation. And another book I would say, also speaking to Alicia's comment there, Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. Fantastic book, influenced by Colombian America. Yeah, I enjoyed that book. I thought it was great. It has the best prologue. The prologue is fantastic to that book, but wonderful way of showing different, indigenous tribes and cultures. And I understand that's huge representation for Rebecca Roanhorse in her books. And as far as I always recommend Kindred by Octavia Butler, which is I think it's a fairly concise, fairly short, on the short side of sci-fi standalone. And I know a lot of people, I always feel like I need to preface this by saying this is not a big epic story. It's more of a quiet story in a way, but I think it's powerful. It's powerful in the way that you follow this character named Dana, who is living in the 1970s, and she's married to a white man, and she's mysteriously brought back in time to early 1800s antebellum South slavery plantation. And she's having to survive as a Black woman suddenly in the slave trade when she goes back there. And she doesn't know why it's happening, but she interacts with a distant ancestor, with a distant relative who turns out to be a white man. And just their relationship is very complex. But I think it really has a lot to say without her telling you how to feel or what to think. And I found it so powerful for that reason personally. So that's one that I highly recommend. And of course, I already mentioned the love songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. But another one I would also recommend, very short, it's a very, very short story, is The Comet by W.E.B. Du Bois. It's only a few pages long. It's a sci-fi, very short story, but it also brings forth some very important themes regarding racism. So highly recommend that as well.
Cool.
Awesome. Chaz, how about you?
Oh man, so many. So one thing that I really look for, to Philip's point on tokenism and things like that, what I really look for is books that treat diversity as normal, but because it is normal, even though there are people in the world that treat it as abnormal, it's normal. We've got so much diversity around us, and so that's one thing that I loved the Broken Earth trilogy for, was diversity is just assumed in that book. What's treated as abnormal is the fact that some people are orogenes and can create these tremors and different things like that. But diversity in terms of race and skin color and things like that, it's just assumed and treated as normal. So I really like that. I look for that in books. And another book that I highly recommend that, again, treats it as normal and promotes it as normal is The House in the Cerulean Sea.
Oh, I want to read that one too.
Ursi, it is so good. It's a tissue box read. I was crying so hard during different points of it, but it's a beautiful little book about these kids who are in this orphanage for really just, I looked, it's kind of like, in Rudolph, the Island of Misfit Toys, that's kind of what this orphanage is like. It's these kids that just don't quite fit in because of their different abilities. But it wasn't only that. it just paints this beautiful picture of love, despite what you look like, despite what your sexual preference are. I mean, there's a really beautiful gay relationship that develops in the book that I thought was just amazing, and it's treated as normal, which it should be, and that was really important to me. So I think for this one, I'm going to pick House in the Cerulean Sea. There's so many others, and I hope we get to talk about them, but that's the one I want to promote right there, because it speaks to the heart, I think, of what we're really talking about in this video.
And I think it goes back to what Philip was saying earlier about like finding that humanity within these stories and seeing where we can connect, you know?
Yes.
And
the humanity. Thank you.
So great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What about you, Fine?
Well, mine was stolen twice now. So I mean, I picked Black Sun as well. Now I have a gazillion others. But Black Sun for me, definitely the Colombian inspiration and that whole lore that Rebecca Roanhaus brought in was just so mind-blowing for me. But also something that I first didn't understand and then realized while I was reading it, she was using gender-neutral pronouns in there.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Non-binary characters. And I don't know any other fantasy or sci-fi book that is using the Z gender-neutral pronouns. And I was so blown away by that. And it was something, again, like, you know, it just needs to be normal. It's normal in her book. I didn't know those pronouns existed before I read this book. So,
and you have visually impaired representation as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. So that she just put in so many things that just are in the world, and she is not making it into something this is very unique or this is something, you know, that is not accepted in the world. It just is in this world, and that's why I really liked it so much. Mm-hmm. But then in general, also from a representation perspective, I think Maddie, you just said the Grace of Kings. I need to be careful because there's Ruin of Kings and Grace of Kings, and I read them right one after another, so it's really confusing. But Grace of Kings, when it comes to Asian representation, is a phenomenal book. And what I loved about it, so where you have a lot of, or like where Ruin of Kings, as an example, also has Asian representation, but it is still in a rather Western-like setting with things like Asian food and some Asian characters in there. Whereas Grace of Kings is completely written with Asian culture in mind, and the whole world is very inspired by the Asian culture and everything. So just the writing style is so different to what we used to in a Western society. The way he just tells the story feels foreign, which just shows how good he did that. And there's so many things like there's an aspect of the story where it's about losing someone's face. And that is a very typical thing in Asian culture, right? So he did a really good job in implementing Asian culture and showing us how great it is and how amazing it is. And besides, the food descriptions also are really good in this book. So again, don't read it when you're hungry. But yeah, that would be one of the recent reads right now that I've had that are really good. I mentioned Gunmetal Gods already. I really like that deep dive into the Middle Eastern lore of that. Also in a much earlier time than a lot of other Middle Eastern books that they use. So Samuel Akhtar went into a much earlier time from a time period and was inspired by that. And there's just so much great stuff to find and to figure out and to learn from that I can't wait to read it again when book 3 comes out in that series. But yeah, that's it for me.
Can I add one more?
Sure.
I know.
I know who has a list a mile long now. I did want to add one more. It's what I forgot about, and I was kind of looking at my notes because I had made a few notes. And I'm like, oh, I forgot this one, and that's the Ballad of Black Tom. I don't know if any of you have read it, but it's a short book. It's a novella by Victor Laval, and he's an author of color, by the way. But the Ballad of Black Tom, if you've ever read, I can't remember the name of the Lovecraft story now, but it's a retelling of a story by H.P. Lovecraft, who we all know was a famous racist. among other, just a xenophobe in general, but specifically a lot of racial issues there. But this, the horror at Red Hook, there it is. It's a retelling of the horror at Red Hook, and it follows a street musician named Tom. He a black street musician. He's, he plays his music on the street, trying to take care of his dad, who's very ill, trying to bring money home, and it really shows in a stark spotlight on the horrors of a racial separatism during that time, and the lengths that somebody will go to take care of those people they love, and to stand out and be noticed. It's just it's an amazing book. I've read it twice. I'm probably going to do a yearly reread on it. So okay, I'm off my box now, but it's really, really good.
Yeah. And just because, we talked about him earlier today, Touch of Light, also, just to reiterate that, we talked about your book earlier. Your ears must have been ringing or something. Yes, we did. So, hey, welcome.
welcome. Yes. Glad you're here. I need to read your book. Yeah.
Same. I just got it for my Kindle too, and I'm like, I gotta read it.
I haven't picked it up yet.
The cover alone is worth picking it up.
Beautiful.
I saw the cover. I think Andrew did a review for it today or yesterday, and I saw the cover. I'm like, wow, that's a cover.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. One of the questions that I was really excited about to ask in this group, because Chaz, you and Philip talked about that actually while you were talking as part of your Chaz with Friends series, and that is as fantasy readers, do we have an advantage when it comes to diverse reading? I know you talked about this a little bit already, but I thought in this group that would be also interesting to pick that up. So let's see, which order do we do now? Let's start with Philip. I don't think we have started with you yet.
And I can cheat because we already talked about it with Chaz. So yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that fantasy has the capacity to delve into the imagination perhaps further than in any other genre. And maybe I'm biased. I love fantasy, but I do think that fantasy has this advantage to imagine worlds. If you want to, for example, the Malazan series, which everybody knows I'm very big on, and Joanna knows them too and loves them. But this is a world where Stephen Erickson and Ian Esselmont deliberately set about to make it a very inclusive world where, there's the default, is for the characters is that they have darker skin. And there's also an important equality when it comes to access to power. So people and high-ranking military people who empresses, people running the show can be male or female, or whatever. Doesn't gender doesn't play into it. As well as access to magic, very importantly, which is something that is accessible to everyone. Everyone, literally, in that world can access magic. So that I think fantasy has this advantage of being presenting worlds that are removed from the types of prejudices and biases that we traditionally have in our own world, and by presenting that can make us think, okay, wow, and I think that's what great literature does too. It makes us reflect on our own world. So having that psychic distance, having the ability to have this story off in this other world and engage in that world, and then come back to our world and think, okay, well, what can I learn from that other world here? And how do I apply that to the world around me? Fantasy is uniquely suited to do this, to deliver that psychic distance. And at the same time, you can write fantasy where there is prejudice and where there is misogyny, and you can deal with those themes as well in that world where maybe it's a little bit easier for us as readers to engage with those very hard truths of existence. These things have happened in our history, in our world, and are happening in the present in our world. And there are important things to engage with. And fantasy maybe it makes it a little easier to read about those things in an imagined world and then come back again to our world. So in several respects, I think that fantasy has an advantage. I would say yes to the question. It does have an advantage when it comes to diverse reading in those senses.
Yeah. The what if scenario, right? Not just fantasy, sci-fi really too. So the question should have been fantasy, sci-fi, right? The what if scenarios. Yeah. Agreed.
So just to add to what Philip said, since I read Malazan Book of the Fallen, I would say it has that too. It has misogyny and it has races against each other as well. So, but you also see what you talked about as well. You also see sort of evening of the playing field when it comes to those things as well. And also, I just want to add, so Philip, because you influenced me to pick this up, maybe I am actually right now reading Behave, which is a nonfiction book about. It really goes deep into implicit bias and othering and the way our brains do that. And so I have to say though, like when in regards to like the ideas of altruism and empathy and compassion, after I was reading this, I'm still reading it, but reading that section, I just got emotional all over again over Malazan Book of the Fallen and the way it handles that. I could not agree more with Stephen Donaldson that Malazan Book of the Fallen has a way to, I guess fantasy in general does have a way to sort of present these issues in a secondary world and offer the readers the opportunity through that experience to sort of bring it back reintegrate it into our own world. I definitely think that's the case, especially with that series. And I would say also another series that comes to mind with that too, honestly, is even though I have some criticisms of it, but I would definitely say that the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang, I think a lot of us can say, I know I've said it, a lot of other people have said it, that it's brought attention to a part of the history of China that we otherwise maybe wouldn't have put as much attention on. And I think that that's been that's just been a very enriching experience on its own because of that. And I do think that R.F. Kuang has a lot of skill in what she did in that series, and I look forward to what she writes next.
I think she's got a new book coming out. Like, what is it? Babel?
Yeah.
It looks really cool too.
Yeah. But I'll just say, I mean, I'm a fantasy reader, and I honestly don't know that I would have gone out of my way to read about the raping of Nanking or, those kinds of things. But having that psychic distance, like Philip was just saying, in reading the Poppy War trilogy, it broke my heart, but it still helped me. It just, I don't know. I felt like it was something I felt like I needed in my life to understand, or helped me, I guess, just open up my awareness. Just the important part about this topic.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think it's also like a kind of yes/no answer. So I think it's getting better now to the point that we made earlier, right? We see it more that it becomes better. But when I started that whole thinking about, okay, what are great diverse fantasy sci-fi books that I've read throughout my life? Because I've been a reader since young childhood. One of the advantages when your parents work in a bookstore all day long, you get books like literally every holiday.
Nice.
But when I was living in Germany, like in my, before I moved here, fantasy was already back then my main genre. And I loved like the German fantasy authors. And now in hindsight, now that I'm thinking back, they are all white men. And they all write the typical Western, the typical fantasy story where you're like, okay, it's all same. They just, tell the story a little bit different. I love them. Nevertheless, I love my Marcus Heitz. I love my Bernard Hennen, and I love the Elven and the Dwarfs and all of these stories. But again, now that I'm looking more for it and am myself more proactive, I find that there is more out there when it comes to the fantasy part. And yes, both points, right? What Philip and Joanna already said, definitely, because fantasy allows you to go through those what if situations and think through, hey, how could this situation be, if we would be more open and talk about it? Or how is the world on the other end of the globe, which doesn't make sense, like the furthest away from where you are, how is the world there? and experiencing all of those things that you could not experience, even if you would travel there, right? If I would go to Japan tomorrow, I would see all the touristy stuff, but I would not actually explore the culture. I would not necessarily learn what it means to be Japanese or to grow up in Japan and all of these things. I already noticed that I spent the first 30 years of my life in Germany, now living in the US. Even both are Western cultures, there are differences in here that I still, even being here for a couple of years now, still struggle with. Mm-hmm. Where I'm like, no, I'm too German for this. I just can't, you know. So
I'm too European for this.
Like small talk. I'm sorry, I don't understand small talk. I can't.
I love that though.
That's awesome.
How's the weather, Tina? How's the weather?
Oh.
See, I can't.
She's like, why do you care?
Right?
This is a total squirrel story. So, but when I was the first time in the US, it was 2013. I've never traveled to the US before when I was living in Germany, but it was the first time here. I was visiting my now husband, and I went shopping. There's like an outlet mall of where we live. So I went shopping, and in every store that I went, I was immediately greeted by someone. I was immediately asked, like, hey, how can I help you? Hey, we have these offers today. Hey, have you heard about our special today? And I'm just like, leave me the F alone. I just want to look what is going on here. I was so irritated by this that I was like, what's going on here? Funny enough, once I moved here and then went back to Germany like a year or two later, I went shopping, and we were in Berlin just, doing touristy stuff because my husband never was in Berlin at that time. And I went into a shop and I was looking around for the assistant to help me with something because I was actually looking for something. And she was standing at the cash register looking at the computer doing something, typical German. And I'm like, hey, I'm here. Can you please pay attention to me now?
So the customer matters.
Anyway, but it's like, but that's like funny things that happen even in similar culture. But yeah, where was I? Oh yeah, diverse reading. So yeah, I think fantasy really allows you to see the world from a perspective that if you would go there, would just never be able to see. And to the point of motherhood, right? Same with LGBTQ. If you are not part of that group, how would you get that experience, right? How would you be able to understand what their viewpoint is? And yeah.
And yeah, I feel this way. And at the same time, I could definitely think of books I've read that were either nonfiction or that were like outside of the genre of fantasy that helped with that too. So it kind of, I don't know.
Yeah.
Question.
Yep.
Do you feel though that if you think about a thriller or a romance, do you feel that those genres, to Philip's point and to your point, Joanna, that they try to go through something that you wouldn't go through in real life, like the racism discussion, like normalizing not being racist? That is a weird way of saying that. But do you feel that thrillers and romance and these more closer to reality genres try to show us what a world could be as much as fantasy and sci-fi?
Okay, I see what you mean. I don't, when I think of the nonfiction ones, not necessarily, no. They're showing you a very critical view of those perspectives. Like one that's coming to mind that I read years ago is a contemporary YA book called Frankly in Love. And it was, I don't know if you all heard of it. Have you heard of it, Ursi?
Yeah, I read that one a few years back.
Yeah. So it's like it was a romance between a African-American girl and a Korean. No, not, I'm sorry. No, I'm thinking of a different one. There was a different one that did that.
I think he was Asian, right? Was it Korean?
Okay. So yeah, there were two that I read, and one did involve a Korean boy and an African-American girl. But this one, Frankly in Love, was
a white girl.
Korean guy with a white girl. And he's first generation Korean. So his parents came from Korea. And so you understood his challenge with having a Korean identity and his parents wanting him to be Korean in the traditional Korean sense and him feeling more American than Korean. And then dealing with this sort of challenge of being with an American white girl And just seeing that problem play out and understanding that, it really helped me. It gave me so many insights to what it would be like to be Korean American. So many insights, so much so that actually one of my best friends is married to a Korean American. And it's weird because the stories were very lined up. So I felt like I got a perspective that I couldn't have gotten that. I don't know that I could have gotten that through fantasy. But at the same time, as far as what you're talking about, as far as like reimagining the story and recreating it, maybe fantasy lends itself more to that. And I'm just playing devil's advocate because I love fantasy, so it's my favorite genre.
Good morning, Derry.
Morning, Derry.
Hey.
Chaz, I think you're the next one, right?
Oh, yeah. So I definitely think fantasy readers and sci-fi, have an advantage when it comes to diversity. It's kind of, you kind of already mentioned it. I think you mentioned it, Fina, was the traveling aspect of it. We've always heard how in a lot of cases, people who are more well-traveled tend to be more open-minded, more accepting, more willing to hear diverse viewpoints. And I haven't had a chance to travel a whole lot. I've traveled within the U.S., but not out of the country. But I feel like fantasy, with all the different worlds and perspectives that it's given me, has made me a more open-minded, compassionate, and intentional person. And even going so far back as J.R.R. Tolkien, Tolkien was, of course, a white man writing traditional, the fantasy that is so widespread in our culture now that we know of medieval fantasy. And yet there were so many diverse perspectives within Tolkien's world. You've got that subtle hatred between the elves and the dwarves and why they feel that way toward each other and how they've treated each other and had their disagreements and the different perspectives that they have because of the culture that they've grown up in. Even so far back as Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, I think there's a very decent amount of diversity, even in his writing. And then, of course, it's gotten more pronounced in modern times with so many great fantasy epics out there. Some of them you don't even hear about, like one of my favorite Asian-inspired fantasy epics. I don't know if many of you have heard of J.C. King, but the Dragon Songs saga is really, really good. Well, I shouldn't say I've only read the first couple of books. I need to finish the series, but I really, really loved his perspective in writing that great series. So it gives you an opportunity to travel to so many different locales, many of which are inspired by real world locales. So it gives you a perspective on that location, on that culture, without specifically saying, oh, hey, it's this culture. But it's so similar, and you know it and you understand it, that you get a window into that world. Mm-hmm. So it allows you to travel without traveling, if that makes sense. And but you get some of those similar benefits.
Yeah.
And even with the Dark Tower, Philip and I have been. I know you've been reading it too, Joanna, and so many great. There's some things I don't like, some choices that I would change, but overall, the series does a really good job of dealing with race issues, of dealing with mental health issues and things like that. That it's in kind of, it starts off in an American Western setting anyway, but it's not your traditional American Western setting. Mm-hmm. And you get to travel to these different worlds and experience these different people through the series. So it's just yeah, I think reading fantasy does give a distinct advantage with understanding diversity and the importance of it.
Hey, Ellen.
Hey,
Ellen!
Alan.
I was quick into
Boosh.
here. How would you receive?
So I guess to round it up, I think the fantasy genre, the advantage that it has in general, or even like sci-fi, is its room to play, right? Like it can play around. You can be in a whole different world and create a whole new different like wherever, right? Or even with sci-fi, right? You can explore this idea of how a new space colony would be set up, right? Like what would go into that? Who would be able to go? Right? Or like this whole idea of like who gets to go up into the new space station, right? Like who gets to leave Earth, right? Like who, we can play with these ideas, and I think that it has that room to really dive deep into these broader themes and these concepts, right? And so I think with that, it does have an advantage for sure. Giving those readers that chance to explore all of these different ideas or how people interact with one another too, and you know, especially with more traditional fantasy, like with the different races, like you were mentioning earlier. How do we apply the things that happen in real society in this in this fantastical world? And I think that that's where the advantage is. I think even going back, another series that I know not that many people are that much of a fan of, but like the Aragon series, right, by Christopher Paolini, right? And
great.
Yeah, well, I really like those books. And one of the things that I took away from that book a lot is this idea of the misinformation when it comes to the different perspectives on race, right? Like I think that was one of the big lessons that was learned through here, is like you have this perception of like the orcs, right? And people are like, oh, like they're barbarians and they're this and then, but then when you really get to know them, like there's actually a culture there. There's actually a civilized world within that people weren't even giving a chance to learn about. And then once they finally do, they're like, wow, this is a beautiful culture. This is great, you know? And these are the kind of lessons that we can apply towards our real everyday life, right? Like learning about different cultures and learning about different peoples that we might have a certain perspective on because of education or society or culture or our own you know, beliefs from our families and stuff that may not actually be the truth, I should say, right? Like you start learning about different people if you open your mind to act, you know, to want to learn about it. And I think with fantasy, you're kind of thrown into those worlds and you're kind of put on this journey towards learning about the elves and the dwarves, the orcs, and all these different people, right? Like you're learning about all these different things, and we can definitely apply that in our everyday lives.
Yeah. Children of Time is a really good book for that too, when it comes to, you know, first of all, those in space, who is allowed to go to space.
Yeah.
And then also the learning about cultures that you have like a prejudice for. So I don't know how much you know about Children of Time, but
No, I haven't read that one. Yeah, I want to.
Definitely do. I loved it. And it's about spiders. And I was like, what? You start rooting for the spiders at the end of the book. And you were there like, yay, spiders. And like something you would never do in your whole life. Like, nope. I'm
Yeah,
spiders. Exactly. Not in my house.
That's Tchaikovsky, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
okay.
I'd love to respond to what Ersi said, because I loved both the major points that you made. And so I'm curious, based on what you were saying, maybe an advantage that fantasy has and sci-fi is that it can sort of reimagine sort of the systemic issues of the world. Whereas you can't get that pretty much. I mean, you don't see that as much in other types of fiction, because you can actually build new social structures, new you know, political systems. So you can kind of deal with, and even like what we were just talking about in Moaz and Book of the Fallen, sort of even the playing field with magic and with with hierarchy and everything regarding.
Sorry, John, I don't mean to interrupt your thought process.
Sorry, yeah, that was a great comment. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, Joanna.
I didn't read it, but it's okay. I'll read it. So yeah, I just wonder if maybe that, like, dealing with the systemic, larger framework of things is what I gathered from what you were saying. And then the second point that you were making about fantasy races is interesting too, because I think that I find that fantasy, whether it's magical beings or races in fantasy, they don't always, but sometimes I do feel like a lot of times thematically they teach us about our own conditioning and our own sense of how we deal with othering in the world. So I think that's cool. You brought that up.
That's beautifully said, Joanna and Ursi, both of you. I like the way Derry put it in the comments too, where
yes, I was going to ask about that. Yeah,
I think that's a brilliant way to put it, and it's kind of what I was trying to say as well, that it allows us to engage with issues in a world where it might be easier to engage with those issues over there because there's less at stake in a way. We come into that world without the same biases that we have in our own world, and that then you leave that world, and probably makes it a bit easier, perhaps, to see your own biases in this world. So I think that's really well said.
Yeah, and it might even be the case where you, and I gather that maybe this is the case with Broken Earth, but I haven't read it yet, but where you can read a fantasy book and suddenly it's almost weird to you that there is this possibility, like, and this where it highlights, oh, that's a problem that's not happening in our world, or, you know what I mean? There could be different ways of reimagining that. And even just, I don't know, I think that is a powerful thing. I mean, even thinking of the Red Rising series, I feel like that series kind of did a good job of sort of exploring, and I haven't totally finished it. I have to read the last book, but it seems to sort of be exploring what happens after the revolution, what happens after you go through that kind of thing. So I like those kinds of explorations in books, because I think they point to some critical thinking questions, even when we look at our own politics, when we look at our own political arguments and what we're for or against, and how fantasy can kind of show you both sides of an argument.
I wonder, now that you're saying that, if it would be something to explore, and it might sound like a silly comment, but I actually think there could be some truth behind it. In sociology, I think that's how you pronounce it, sociologists try to think through exactly those things, right? We have all of those systemic issues that are more and more prevalent and more people are talking about. How could we solve for them, right? They go through that thought experiment. Fantasy could help them see those things. Or you could use, being an author, you could use fantasy to think through, if you're about to write a book, to think through those things. And it's like, hey, here's an argument of how you could solve for it this way.
I think that's so brilliant, because so much of our politics these days feels like it's still highlighted on what's wrong and what's wrong and what's wrong. And we never really think through solutions, and then there are questions of possible solutions. And fantasy just does an amazing job of that. And I know Derry reads a lot of the Discworld books, or she promotes those on her channel quite a bit. I think Terry Pratchett is probably known for highlighting a lot of those issues.
Yes, Discworld does highlight a lot of those.
Yeah. And brings a humorous touch to it, right? So that you want to read more about it because you think it's so funny. And at the same time, you get to understand more of like, hey, wait a second, this seems familiar.
Yes.
Agreed. And then just Children of Time is, just to go back on that, I think, so that was the comment, Joanna, sorry, that I brought up while you were making
Baron, his comment really puts a light on it too. There's a lot of great stuff in fantasy and sci-fi with that shows the necessity of societies cooperating together versus societies that don't, that have all of these cognitive biases that divide us and separate us and constantly pushing people away, when our society would work so much better if we just all loved and accepted and worked together to make a better society, make the society what we want it to be. And so that's a great point, Baron.
Yeah. Barron for president next.
Right?
Yeah. No,
I'll
agree.
vote.
Hey.
And there is another one. I'm blanking on the title right now, but there is. So Amazon has those short story collections that you can read for free. If you're a Prime member, you don't need to be a Kindle Unlimited member. Prime is just fine. And they have different ones. And there is a. It's called, I think, the Forward Collection. It's a. I can't think of the word right now. Whatever. It's 6 different short stories between 20 and 70 pages each. All sci-fi from a variety of authors. And one of those stories, I think it was something called The Ark or something similar, also plays with this. How can all the societies work together towards one common goal? So one of those short stories is very interesting in that regards too. And doesn't take you 600 pages if you want to read something short with a scene.
Thanks.
I do have a question though.
Yeah.
It is going to go way back to something that Philip said earlier, and I was just really curious about this. And here's my question: we brought up the idea of like motherhood in stories, right? And then I thought about it. I was like, are there a lot of books on like fatherhood that I haven't really seen that many with like the focus on fatherhood? You know, like I've seen a lot, I guess more recently on like motherhood, or maybe I'm just seeing it more since I am a mom, right? But I don't think I've seen that many on like fatherhood aside from like the traditional of like following in my father's footsteps, right? Like, but not so much on like the concept of like fatherhood, you know? I don't know if that's something you guys know more of, because I don't think I do. Yeah, it's like you think about it now and you're like,
I have to think about that.
Not a fantasy that I know, but I've read the Rise of Emperors series. It's a historical fiction set in Rome. It's 3 books, and besides that, those 3 books have incredible character work that I was completely amazed with. One of the things that I really enjoyed about this book is the topic father and son relationship, and how the love between father and son can be. I'm not a parent, so I don't know what it means to be a parent. I don't have that experience, and I never, because I also never wanted to be a parent, I never understood what it means, like what that relationship means, that love means. And this book was the only one that I've read so far when it comes to parenting in general, where it's like, now I can follow that thought process of what it means to be a parent. And that is specifically a father-son relationship in those books. So if you like historical fiction in a Rome setting, that would be one. And then Farseer. 3 people are seeing Farseer.
Oh, okay, nice.
I haven't read those books yet, so I didn't.
Yeah, they're amazing, and it's interesting because that sort of brings up the point that a lot of our fantasy protagonists are orphans.
Yes.
So
right.
It's father figure for a reason, or sometimes mother figure, and that's a whole different topic. But one final thing I wanted to say too on the idea of fantasy science fiction being great reflections of our world and coming away from those stories. Sometimes it's really quite astounding how effective that is. There's a short story that I teach by Ursula Le Guin, and it's called The Ones That Walk Away from Omelas. And it is such a powerful story. It's about a city. I don't know how much I can spoil it for you guys, but it's about a city where everything is perfect except for one little thing, which maybe I won't say what it is. But it's such a powerful story because there's a moment there. Usually my students will realize it on their own, but sometimes during the class discussion, you can see the realization come in their eyes when they realize this is a mirror that we're looking at here. This isn't just some make-believe place. This really applies to us. And it's a very powerful experience. And then you realize an array of emotions, and it's just such a moment of self-awareness that I've rarely seen with any other piece of literature. So it's just one of my favorite examples of how engaging in a totally made-up world can shed light on our own experience here.
Love that.
Oh my goodness, the list is like, this is 3 months of reading already.
I know. I'm gonna take a picture
okay,
and post it on like Twitter of like all the post-it notes that I
It never ends.
That's why I like you guys. I cannot watch any video of any of you without being, oh yeah,
oh
this
my
book.
gosh.
Perils of booktube.
Oh
right?
my goodness.
Right. The benefits and the perils. Yeah, it's good and it's not good. I was telling Fina that before we started the stream. I'm like, you know, I can't watch your videos without coming away with a list of books that I either haven't heard of or know that have heard of, and I need to read more. And yeah. And it's same with all of you as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's a reason why I invited you guys here. Awesome. And just knowing that we're getting close to the 2 hours, I'm fully aware of that. Thanks for the patience here. Just to close it out, I know we mentioned a couple of those throughout the conversation already, but before we walk away, I would love to hear maybe each of you has like one recommendation for those who like to diversify their reading. What would you tell them to do, or what would you recommend to them? Oh, where do we start? I don't know. Ina, Mina, Mina, Mu, Ursi.
Okay. So I think the biggest rule that, well, not rule, but something that I did and that has helped me kind of diversify my reading is throwing out the rules, right? And just, if you find something that interests you, like go for it, you know, and not be not limiting yourself to, maybe I won't know, or maybe I won't understand. Maybe this is too out of the box for me, right? Like go outside the box. Who's making up these rules? You know, just let go. I think it's one of the biggest things that I've learned. I used to only, because of, you know, I majored in history and humanities and all that kind of stuff. I used to read a lot of classics. And since discovering BookTube and everything, I've grown so much in terms of like what I've read and what I want to read, because I've let go of what is expected to read, right? Like what makes a good library, the classic library, right? Just letting go of those ideas, I think, is not to say that those books are bad, but just letting go of that and knowing that there's so much more out there, I think would allow for people to really diversify what they have when it comes to reading. Because at the end of the day, reading's for entertainment, right? Like for the most part. And so why not read something that's going to bring you joy that might be a little bit outside of your comfort zone? Like just go for it.
Yeah. And if you find a book, to Kaiju's point, right? If you find a book that you like, well, check out if there are others that are similar, you know, with the same topic and whatnot. Yep. All right, let's go in the other direction. Chess.
Oh, well, so yeah, I would say the same. You know, read what you want, but also, you know, be intentional. I think a lot of it does go back to you know, what Philip said much earlier in the stream about the excuse that we make, the excuses that we make for not reading more broadly and more diversely is, oh, I don't know where to find it, or I don't, you know, I'm just I don't know where to start and things like that. And I think a lot of it just has to be, you know, be intentional. You know, Google's really good about picking things up from words you type in. So even if you don't know what something is called, just go type a word in and see if there's a book out there for it, if you're interested in it. There's numerous ways to find books that speak to these different topics and new topics that you may never have heard of before. You know, and BookTube is another great tool. My reading tastes and experiences have expanded exponentially since I started watching BookTube and then starting my own channel. So yeah, it's just choosing to diversify. I like that, Derry. It's an act in itself, deliberately including different concepts. Yep. in the browse field.
That could be a
So
t-shirt, just choosing to diversify as an act in itself.
yes,
Mhm.
absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree. So so that would be my recommendation is just do it. Be intentional about it. Go out there and find it. It's there to be found. I like that. Let the FOMO go. Yeah.
Well, the problem is BookTube gets you into that FOMO.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll give you an idea here.
But
Do you see that stack there? Do you see that stack? That's BookTube.
Right?
Yes.
Exactly.
Like
Yeah.
most of these books, I'm telling you, I'm always like, okay, I heard about this one. I'm like, I got it. I want to read it. I haven't read this one yet. I got it. I want to read it. You know?
Right, exactly. I think he does make a good point though too, in the fact that we can get so wrapped up in what's popular, and maybe it's not popular, but maybe it's popular in a certain niche like BookTube or something like that, and we're like, oh, I've got to read that, so I'm going to set this other book down. That maybe you've got a book that you've really been wanting to read that speaks to a different topic that you're not used to reading, and it's going to give you a different perspective. But then there's this other book over here that's really popular and you don't want to miss out. Let the FOMO go. I think that's kind of what he's getting at, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that's good because if we've got the intention to read something, regardless of what's popular, just read it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. It's the newest, latest, and greatest books are still going to be there a couple months later or whatever. So yeah.
And then you might get faster access through your library by that time.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Pro library.
Yes.
Joanna, how about you?
Well, I would say watch your series, Josephine. So watch the Reading Across the Shelves series because you'll get tons of inspiration. And I loved Baron's comment about let the FOMO go because there could be a lot of fear of missing out on diverse books. So I think for me personally, what's helped me to read more diversely, honestly, is BookTube and following booktubers who love to read diversely. And I consider all of you in that category of people I follow on BookTube who read diversely. And that's how I've gotten most of the book recommendations that I've come up with in this video.
Yeah. And to add to that, Angela definitely has an amazing channel. She was one of the first that I found too when it comes to that. And then, my BookTube view from there grew. Yay. So yeah, she's also amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also loved Ursi's idea about not having any hard rules about this because there's a lot when it comes to diversity. We talked a lot in this particular discussion specifically about people of color and people in other regions of the world, but there's a lot of other areas of diversity to cover, whether it's, we talked about young versus old, but I mean, like you could talk about different ages, different perspectives regarding age in life or mental health or socioeconomic status. And there are a lot of other different ranges to look at when it comes to reading diversity.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, I guess I just you all said it so beautifully, and BookTube is such a wonderful place to learn about reads that I never would have picked up on my own. That's for sure. So I guess I would my little bit to add is to say that being open to or even embracing the idea of finding yourself in people you think of as completely different from you can introduce you to some of the most beautiful experiences of your life. So that is certainly something that I have found in my life. And so it's just it's a wonderful thing, to be able to do that and to be in a diverse community and to learn from each other. Doesn't get better. That's certainly why I'm here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Beautiful thing.
Yeah. And as you read more diversely too, you start to possibly pick up things about previous books that you've read that you didn't see before.
Yes.
Or even different authors. Like I just recently learned And, you know, they didn't really tell you in school, or at least they didn't in mine. I just recently learned that Alexander Dumas is biracial. I did not know this.
Yeah.
I didn't know
And
that.
so, you know, that would be, I haven't read any of his books yet, but that will make it, give me an interesting perspective going into it. I might pick up things in the Count of Monte Cristo when I read it that I might, that give a window into his world as a biracial author that I wouldn't have had I not known that. I don't know, but yeah, the greater your reference base. Thank you, Derry. That's perfectly put.
Yeah. Yeah. And if
Love
you
that.
are wondering where to find booktubers, something that I've done is I looked for book tags, because all of a
Yes.
sudden you see a whole bunch of people and you go down a rabbit hole. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing.
Especially the BookTube newbie tag. I found so many people with that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My watch late, like, what is it? Watch later list is insane.
Oh man, mine is too. It's a mile long. Oh yay!
You kaiju.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Oh yay!
Ah, awesome. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining. That was so much better than I thought this conversation could have went. I really appreciate you all for joining in, for you, Chaz, Ursi, Philip, and Joanna, and also for all the ones that were in the chat or that watching that as a recording later on. I'm really excited that there's so much interest about talking about diverse books and diversity and representation in books and all those things. And as Joanna said, this is just the first in a series, so there's more to come. I'm planning on having one per month, not two all the time, one per month, one of these conversations per month with more focused, different topics. Although in May, we actually have to. So if you want to join the next one, May 7 is coming up with mental health representation in books. And we have RJ Gibson on that conversation and Kate from the Literary Apothecary.
Oh, that's so
And
awesome.
then May 28 or 29, we haven't narrowed down a date yet. We will talk about Asian inspiration in books. And there I have Jake from The Bookish Drummer and his girlfriend Stacy, and Lana from Lore and Lullabies. So if this is a topic you're interested in, let me know. There's still space to join. As you can see, there's a lot of people that fit into one conversation. So let me know if you want to join, or join the chat as you did maybe right now, and just, have the conversation with us. And with that, again, thank you for joining. Thank you for being here. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Fina.
Yes.